Today, as I said, we are concluding a series where I have been sharing with you some common spiritual concepts and teachings that were espoused by both Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha and Jesus the Christ. And today I've entitled the talk, Living Lightly, Exploring the Path of Detachment and Renunciation. That's a mouthful. But as I was looking back over that, I thought really, to me, the key can be summed up with the idea of living lightly, or living with open hands, being able to not cling or grasp and be able to be more open, more receptive. The concepts of detachment and renunciation are deep spiritual concepts, but they're not necessarily the kinds of words or language that we typically use in metaphysics. In metaphysics, we work very much with consciousness, with the mind. We work with the ideas of affirmations and denials and visualization and manifestation. And I think these are all good and wonderful tools and practices. And I think there is also a place for enriching and deepening our spiritual understanding and our spiritual journey around these deeper concepts, I think, concepts of detachment, concepts of renunciation. I can remember in seminary when we would talk about topics such as these, particularly the topic of detachment. I struggled with it way back then because I thought it meant to be disinterested, to not have any passion about anything, to not really care about anything. And I thought, that may be spiritual, but I don't want that. I care. I'm interested in many things. I want to be engaged and involved. But eventually, eventually I came to understand that that's not what detachment is. Detachment does not mean being indifferent. It doesn't mean not caring. It simply means not clinging to and attaching like this to anything that is impermanent. It is the idea of loosening our grip on control, loosening our grip on the way things are going to turn out, the outcome, the manifestation of things. It rests on the idea that nothing is permanent. Have you noticed that? Nothing is permanent. Everything is changing all of the time. And I do believe that there's truth in the idea that things for our generation and our lifetime are changing even faster than they did in previous generations and in previous lifetimes. And perhaps that should suggest to us to consider these topics even more, the practicality of these topics. What would life be like if we could be less attached, if we could be more open, if we could be more fluid with the changes, the ebb and the flow of life? Doesn't mean we don't care. It doesn't mean we don't have preferences. It doesn't mean we don't work toward creating more of the kind of life that we would like to experience for ourselves or for our loved ones. But it does mean that we go about it in a different way, in a more open way, in a more detached way. So the way that I'm using it here spiritually, detachment refers to releasing our emotional or mental attachment to outcomes, material possessions, or external circumstances. Let me repeat that. The way that I'm using it here is that detachment refers to releasing our emotional or mental attachment to outcomes, material possessions, or external circumstances. Take that in for a moment. Take that in. Think about something that maybe you have been really wrestling with, something maybe you've been really struggling with, or something you've been trying and efforting so hard to bring about or to avoid. If something comes to your mind that fits that description, take a moment to consider what would it be like if you could just loosen up a little bit around that. If you could loosen up your mental and emotional energy around that. to be a little more open, a little more spacious is another beautiful word, a little more spacious around that. It doesn't mean apathy. It doesn't mean indifference. When we can open up, when we can create a little more space, a little more openness around the things that we care about, what it does is it allows us to experience in its place a greater sense of peace, a greater sense of calm. We have a practice in metaphysics when we talk about praying for something or affirming and visualizing something. We encourage one another to do that. But a way that it comes into play here, that the idea of detachment, the idea of loosening our mental or emotional control around the outcome, is we may pray for something and visualize that thing. And then we say not just the words, but we try to hold the energy and the mindset of this or something better. This or something better. Can you feel the difference there? When we are so focused on it's got to just be this, that's attachment. That's attachment. It's as if we're not giving life, the universe, God, whatever we want to call that, any room to work through us, beyond us, to perhaps open us up to something even better than what our own best thinking can come up with. One of the significant benefits of recognizing and doing our best to loosen up control around outcomes, mental and emotional control, is that we wind up feeling more peaceful. I think we also wind up feeling more optimistic. More optimistic. Jesus warned about attachments. He may not have used the same words that the Buddha used, but he did talk about the idea of material attachments when he taught his followers not to store up treasures on earth, but to store up treasures in heaven. What does that mean? What does that mean? I think the mystical teaching of that is right in line with this idea of don't be attached to anything physical. It's impermanent. It's not going to last forever. But then what does it mean when he says to store up treasures not on earth, and not be attached to the stuff physically on earth? Enjoy it, but enjoy it with openness, with fluidness. But what does it mean then when he's suggesting don't store up treasures here on earth, store up treasures in heaven? The word that was used, the Greek word that heaven was translated from, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, was oranos. And conveyed in the idea of oranos is the idea of consciousness. So now substitute the word heaven for consciousness. Don't store up treasures. Don't be attached to the stuff here. Store it up in consciousness. Is that not a different take on it? Right? It's to build our lives from the inside out, to build memories, to build experiences, to know that it's not about this, even though we might work very hard and there might be many things we want to manifest in our lives. We do it with the energy and the attitude of this or something better. We do it with the energy and the attitude of not being mentally and emotionally attached to it. How do we know the degree to which we are mentally and emotionally attached to something? You want to know how you know? If that something doesn't happen, look at how you respond to it, right? If we're, kvetching, if we're whining, if we're complaining, if we're just feeling like the whole world has come to an end, well, that's kind of suggestive that we were pretty attached to it. Would you not agree? Would you not agree? Jesus also taught and warned about money being the root of all evil, but that's not quite right. It wasn't money being the root of all evil. It was the love of money being the root of all evil. We could say the love of anything physical, anything material, being the root of evil or being the root of unpleasantness, or in Buddhist terms, it would probably be the root of suffering, right? The love of, when he used that word, I believe he was trying to convey this idea again of what? Of attachment to it. Attachment to it. I have thought about this so much over recent years that if there was one quality that I wish I had a magic wand and I could remove from human nature, perhaps at the top of the list, if not the top, pretty close to it, would be greed. Would be greed. Greed is the attachment to more. It's the attachment to there's never enough. I've got to have more, more, more. And it really comes from an emptiness inside, thinking that somehow the accumulation of more and more stuff is going to somehow fill a hole that I think is a spiritual hole that can't be, filled by stuff. If you think about it, greed has so much power in it to bring people to a place of making the worst decisions they could possibly make for themselves or for others. And again, to me, it is conveyed in this idea of attachment that somehow our sense of well-being, somehow our happiness is going to come about if we can just have the right stuff or just have the right people. Have you ever gotten what you prayed for and then discovered it really wasn't what you needed or wanted after all? Okay, your laughter suggests to me you've had that happen to you as well. The Buddha taught that attachment and craving are the roots of suffering. Think about it. I think about it quite a bit, actually, especially through this series as I've been focusing some more on Buddhist concepts and asking myself, when I feel a sense of suffering, when I feel a sense of unhappiness, why? And if I'm honest with myself, it's usually because I'm resisting something, or I am trying too hard to force or to make something happen before it's time. Both Jesus and the Buddha, I think, emphasize the importance of right relationship with everything, right relationship with our stuff, right relationship with our relationships. Aristotle and Socrates talked about some of this with the idea of moderation, right? And Buddha, the middle path, neither extremes, the middle path. So now let me move, before I give you some examples toward the end here, I want to move into this idea of we have detachment, which is not apathy, it is not indifference, it is loosening our mental and emotional craving or addiction around anything material, anything, any outcome, and trying to control it all. The other teaching that they both shared is this idea of renunciation. And even as I say that word, it kind of sticks in my mouth like words like sin, right? It's like that's so not part of our usual way of thinking and speaking in metaphysics, but the idea behind it, I think, is very spiritual and very much a part, or should be, of metaphysics and of New Thought. To me, renunciation begins with this idea of voluntary simplicity. Say those words with me. Voluntary simplicity. Voluntary simplicity. Years ago, at one of our synthesis dialogues at the Association for Global New Thought, of which I was a Leadership Council board member for almost 20 years, we had convened 3 multi-day gatherings with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one in India, and then 2 in Italy, one in Rome and one in Trento. And we invited to these gatherings some of the world's greatest leaders and thinkers from all around the world, all different backgrounds, different religions, different areas of focus in their passion and in their work. And one of the people that we had invited that I just felt really a close soul connection with was a man by the name of Dwayne Elgin. Dwayne wrote a book called Voluntary Simplicity. And he was probably the first person, and he was speaking about the idea of voluntary simplicity in one of our synthesis dialogues to the group and then also to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And voluntary simplicity is really the idea of looking at one's own lifestyle and life choices, not just from the standpoint of oneself individually, but from the impact that it has on others in the world. This is an idea that I think is gaining much more traction today, even if the word voluntary simplicity isn't the word that's used to describe it. But it's gaining much more understanding and much more popular now than it was, say, in the late 1990s. This idea of voluntary simplicity. It's the idea of, I think it was Gandhi who said this, living simply so others may simply live. Isn't that a beautiful way of thinking about it? Living simply so others can simply live. Living simply so others can simply live. And I remember Dwayne in his presentations, and then when I read his book, I remember feeling so inspired to look more carefully at my own life and ask of myself, well, what can I do toward that end? Now, I said that to me, this is a beginning step toward renunciation. And I put in my notes as I was thinking about this more yesterday, because I thought, I don't want to scare everybody away, and I don't want to pretend that I've got all this mastered, because I certainly don't. But I put in my notes to myself and to share with you, few of us in this day and age are probably ready to practice renunciation the way, say, a monk would, renouncing materialism entirely and giving up all sensual desires. That's not me, and I don't imagine it's most of you online or in this room. But I really do think there's a place where every one of us can look at this idea, this starting point of voluntary simplicity. To me, renunciation is about simplifying and shifting priorities so one can pursue spiritual practice and growth. Shifting focus, shifting priorities, simplifying, so one can experience greater spiritual and personal growth. It takes time, I think, to study and to learn. It takes time to meditate, right? How many people say, I don't have the time to meditate, right? Many of us are prone to saying that. This idea of renunciation, or if you prefer the softer, easier to swallow phrase of voluntary simplicity, would mean that we take a look more critically at where we invest our precious resource of our personal time and effort and say, what could I say no to that really isn't feeding my spirit and my soul, to make more room so that I can meditate, to make more room so I can be more reflective, so I can build a greater capacity for love and understanding and compassion. Those things, I don't think they happen like that. I think we grow into those ways of being over time. I don't think renunciation has to be about austerity, but I think it does invite us to look at our own lives and say, not only where can I shift my priorities so that my spiritual being is nurtured and fed, but also how can I look at living maybe a little more simply so others could simply live. I want to share a few principles and examples of these with you very quickly to make it seem maybe a little more practical or a little more reachable for us, or at least for me. So first is what this can look like, what detachment might look like in a very ordinary practical sense, has to do with looking at our willingness to release control of outcomes. We can prefer an outcome, but there's a difference between preference and demanding, right? I mean, I just look at my body language as I'm saying to you, a preference and demanding. One hand is open, the other is closed, right? There's a physical and visceral kind of difference between those. So releasing the need to control outcomes, it's trusting, if you will, that there is an energy, a spirit, a God, a divine presence that we bear witness to each and every day, that operates in and through us, that we can trust, When we trust it, it becomes easier to release control of the outcome. And so what might that look like in a very ordinary example? It might look like something like this. You're interviewing for a job. You've done all your prep work. You know everything that you can find out about your potential employer. You've updated your resume. You've honed your interview skills. You've anticipated the kinds of questions that they might ask you. You've come with your best thought, your best thinking, your best preparation. You show up, you do the best job that you can, and then you what? You let go of the outcome. You let go of the outcome. And you trust that either you'll get the yes for that job, or if not, that it is this or something better, something better. Non-attachment to material possessions. What might that look like? I think in part it looks like shifting focus from having to being. It shifts us into a place, I think, of greater appreciation and gratitude for what we already have. For what we already have, even though we may be working toward bringing something new into our lives, we are still mindful of and grateful for the good that already exists right now. I know several people in our community, they're no longer physically in San Diego, but I know several people in our community who during some of our worst fire seasons in not too distant past, lost their homes and lost absolutely everything. And I can remember sitting with and being in conversation with several of them, and how even in the midst of the very real loss, the huge loss, the loss of stuff, the loss of memories associated with building a home together and shared meals and holidays and so forth, I can remember how inspired I was and how humbled I was, how each of them shared with me in their own way, but we are safe. And we will do what we can to rebuild. And yes, we miss what we had, but it's not who we are. Is that not a supreme example of being able to appreciate, but also hold lightly, not take your identification from the things that you have? That leads us into a third one of the four that I want to share, freedom from letting our ego run the show. Our ego tends to feed off of things like approval and recognition, success and power. And if we operate and if we let the ego run rampant, we will find that we are forever trying to seek more success, more approval, more validation, more recognition. And again, it's like it's an empty hole. There's never going to be enough of that. What might that look like in a practical sort of way? It could look like a musician who's very, very talented, who can sing or write and play and does his or her very, very best, but they do it as an instrument of something, whether or not the people listening give them the accolades or the approval or the ovations or the credit. Does that make sense? So it's not that the approval might feel great, but it's not why they do what they do. And you know what? I actually think that whether we can put words to it or not, or articulate it, I think that we, listening to someone, a musician, for example, since that's the example I was giving, who is doing what they do for the love and beauty of what they do to the best of their ability, not addicted to your approval or my approval, somehow we recognize the authenticity, I think, of that. I don't even want to call it a performance because I don't think it's a performance. I think it's a genuine sharing. Does that make sense what I'm saying? We sense when something is authentically coming from within as an expression. I think it's an expression of God, if you will, versus I'm doing this because I hope you're going to give me a standing ovation. I'm doing this because I hope you're going to buy a lot of stuff. There's a qualitative difference in it. And the last is what I was touching upon earlier, an earnest looking within ourselves to living more simply so others can simply live. To ask of ourselves, where and how might I step into it, even a tiny bit more practice of voluntary simplicity. The path of detachment and renunciation, I really think, to the extent that we are willing to hold these ideas and step into them even a little bit, that the path is a path really that invites us to live life more lightly. And I think when we live life more lightly, we are much more open. We are much more aware of the different paths before us and willing to go forward with ease and grace and with joy and with a sense of trust that all is in divine order. Namaste.